AI agents are everywhere, automating tasks and making decisions at machine speed. But agents make mistakes. Just one rogue agent can do big damage before you even notice. Rubrik Agent Cloud is the only platform that helps you monitor agents, set guardrails, and rewind mistakes, so you can unleash agents, not risk. Accelerate your AI transformation at Rubrik.com. That's RUBRIK.com.
Hey listeners, this is Peter, and welcome back to the History Shorts podcast. Today's conversation series episode is brought to you by thecollector.com. If you're into mind-blowing dives into ancient history, philosophy, killer art breakdowns, or even epic travel spots with a cultural twist, this is the site that's got it all. Visit thecollector.com. Stories to teach, inform, and inspire. Today on History Shorts. In the pivotal summer of 1863, three extraordinary paths converged on a small Pennsylvania town, forever altering the course of the American Civil War. Today we sit down with the acclaimed historian Tim McGrath to explore his upcoming book, Three Roads to Gettysburg: Meade, Lee, Lincoln, and the Battle That Changed the War. Through the lenses of Union General George Meade's cautious resolve, Confederate General Robert E. Lee's bold gamble, and President Abraham Lincoln's unyielding vision, McGrath unravels the human drama, strategic blunders, and fateful decisions that turned Gettysburg into a watershed moment, not just on the battlefield, but in the soul of the divided nation.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Tim, welcome to History Shorts.
Nice to be on, Peter. Thank you for having me.
So what makes the Battle of Gettysburg so fascinating and worth returning to over and over again when studying Civil War? And what brought you to this Battle of Gettysburg?
That's a good start-off question, Peter. And I think the answer is just the fact that it's such a pivotal battle in our history, especially in the Civil War, which still holds sway over the other conflicts that we've had in our history. I first saw it when I was 10 years old in 1961 and was absolutely caught up in the field itself. There was this wonderful electric map that was still there when I took our kids there in 1994. And they still say when we're lost or something, remember, you are here, the white light at the Gettysburg Center. And it doesn't matter if we got lost in upstate New York or wherever. But I really think that it's because of the fact that it was a turning point in the war. Confederates were not doing well in the Western theater, but Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia were becoming legend even in the, north of the Mason-Dixon line. You just can't beat these guys. And I think the fact that Meade and the Army of the Potomac emerged victorious, and the fact that that allowed, 4 months later, President Lincoln to come and deliver the shortest but most perfect speech, certainly in our history, and maybe the English language, and maybe ever. I've heard people compare it to the Sermon on the Mount as far as, perfect conciseness. But I think that's really what the hold is over everybody.
In focus of these three figures that you did in your book, what surprised you the most about the interplay between their individual psychologies? You have Lee's audacity, Meade's caution, and Lincoln's political pressures. How do you think these three individual psychologies shaped the outcome of Gettysburg?
Another good question. It started for me when my editor at Dutton and my agent said, why don't we do a book on General Meade? And I looked into it, and there's this wonderful lady, Dr. Jennifer Murray, who was recently at Oklahoma State and is now over at Shepherd University, heading up the Civil War programs in West Virginia. And she's at work on a thorough biography of George Meade. So I said, well, I'm not going to compete with that. But what you just said, I was fascinated by these three very different men and how they got there. Um, Lincoln coming from the rough and tumble world of the West and the log cabin, not being formally educated, and yet he emerges as what most of us consider the greatest of our presidents, and certainly the best writer. And he's always compared to Mark Twain. You can't do better than that. And the political pressures that he withstood. But the defining issue for him was a phrase in the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal. He lived and technically you could say died by that. Robert E. Lee, you have this son of a Revolutionary War hero who's a bit of a scoundrel. At one point, he's even trying to pull a fast one on his mentor, George Washington. And, the Lees are very famous in Virginia, but his section of the family isn't that financially well off. And a West Point education is pretty much the best that he can do. And in fact, I was surprised, you were talking about surprises, that throughout his career before the war, he keeps writing to people and saying, I've had enough of this. But again, this brilliant mind and a brilliant engineer. My favorite thing I learned about him was coming to the Mississippi as a young man when St. Louis is in danger of becoming dry docked because of the shift in the current and the amount of silt and mud developing, right alongside St. Louis. Then he doesn't have much money to work with. But he comes up with the idea that the problem is further north, going up to Iowa and the Mississippi coming back there and Grand Rapids. And the trick is not to just blow the rapids away, but just create a fissure by blowing up, separations in the rapids that increase the current. And within a year or two, it's back to normal. He succeeds in ticking off a lot of land speculators from Illinois that are trying to build a new St. Louis across the river where the river is shifting. So it didn't make him too popular. But he's such a unqualified courage. And even in the midst of a battle or preparations for a battle during the Mexican War, Winfield Scott calls him the best soldier he ever saw. And he proves that in the Mexican War, and obviously his track record up to Gettysburg and in some respects after. And then you have George Meade, who's the least known of the three, but like Lincoln with his dad and Meade with his, Meade, armchair psychiatrist could say he had father issues. His father is this brilliant financial wizard who's now in Spain. Meade was born in Cadiz, but he's the third generation of a very successful mercantile family in Philadelphia. And he loses his fortune by lending it to the Spanish government. And that's a long story, but it's just ironic that he even winds up in prison and never recovers his fortune. So his wife, Mrs. Meade's mother, the only avenue that she has is for him also to go to West Point when he's hoping to be a doctor or a lawyer. But again, he has such an adaptable mind. He becomes a terrific engineer. And I knew as a kid that he built lighthouses, spending summers down in the Wildwood, New Jersey. But to see his drawings and read his reports and blueprints from Barnegat down to Florida and all different kinds of challenges from the different climates and the waters and the weather conditions he's dealing with, he understands everything. And it certainly gives him an option to see that the higher the ground for what you're doing, the better. And what does he have in Gettysburg? He has the high ground. So it's really a kind of a fascinating situation coming in. And Lincoln's involvement with Lee is very perfunctory. Everybody, historians and fans of our history know that Lee offered him command of the Union armies, which he turned down because he couldn't draw his sword against Virginia. Um, a much more different relationship that Lincoln has with Meade, who gets pilloried in Washington by not having followed up his battle. And I often think that if Lincoln had visited Gettysburg right after the battle, as he did in the battlefields of Virginia with Chancellorsville and the 7 Days and to Antietam, he might have had a better understanding of the damage that was done to Meade's army and his supplies and his horses.
Breaking this down a little bit, historians still debate Lee's decision to even invade the North. You have the typical narrative of he decided that this was the only way to push the North to say, give up. Do you think there are any, based on your research, any internal conflicts or maybe miscalculations that you believe drove him forward to invade the North?
Well, first, to start off with that, I am by no means a military historian, and they could probably dig into that much well and recite facts. There's one professor who said to me when I told him I was doing a book on Gettysburg, he said, "Good luck, because you're going to find that there are cab drivers who know more about that battle than the PhDs do at times." But I think he was presented with a choice. We want you to take a segment of your army, probably Longstreet's corps, and send it down to Vicksburg to help relieve the siege that Grant's conducting with Confederate General Pemberton, ironically a classmate of Meade's at West Point and also a Philadelphian. And Lee's, Lee's excited about what he's been able to do. Outside of Antietam being, I guess, a draw, you could call it a victory because the Confederates left the field first. But again, McClellan didn't follow up either, and he had ample supplies and men to do so. But I think he felt that the spies coming back to them, the Meade and Washington and everything else, we hit one big damaging blow in the North, go to Pennsylvania. And then we have our option. Do we go to Philadelphia? Do we go to Baltimore, which was a thriving port? Or do we go to Washington and just end this thing? Begin peace negotiations. And I think he won over Davis with that because initially Davis was, we got to hold on to the Mississippi somehow. But Lee's argument won out. And there you get into the situation that Gettysburg, and you know this, and most of your listeners will, neither general's there to start the battle. The battle is started by their subordinate generals, and it just becomes one attack after a defense and another attack and defense and another that piles up, that they're stuck there. The interesting thing, though, is that General Reynolds of First Corps, who was a good friend of Meade's and who ironically turned down the offer to head up the Union Army, had been to Gettysburg the year before and studied it all. And like Wellington said when they were questioning his decision to fight Napoleon at Waterloo, he said, "I found that ground and I kept it in my pocket."
A lot of people don't realize that Meade's appointment as commander really happened right before this battle. What insights, I guess, have you uncovered during your research about this rapid adaptation to leadership? And how do you think that influenced Meade's decisions?
He did not want the command, Peter. In fact, when an acquaintance of his shows up at 3:30 in the morning from Washington, Colonel Hardee, and hands him the letter from the Chief General Halleck that you are to take command of the Army of the Potomac and you'll have all this support and so forth. And he says, "I don't want it." And Hardee says, it's not an offer, it's a command. You are the commander of the Army of the Potomac. But as soon as that comes, and he says, he compares it to going to his, I might as well accept it. It's like going to my own funeral. But once he does, there's always been this image of Meade as and the phrase they always use is like he's this angry snapping turtle of a guy, And in fact, he's quite the opposite. He's a great raconteur. He's a good storyteller. He has a sense of humor, uh, and he uses it during battle engagements, right before something's going on, to sort of drop the anxiety a bit among his officers and his men. But he's the 28th of June is when he's offered the command, and the battle's fought 3 days later, starting on the 1st of June. So I really think he had an immense task. It would be almost like somebody else leading the Israelites out of Egypt and falls down, and God says to Moses, "You're the guy," while Pharaoh's chariots are then zipping up, to something. It's that level of concern, and he's wonderful. I mean, it takes some time. Not everything is always with any battles or even business plans. Not everything comes to work like that, but he really does put things together, and he trusts a couple of his generals implicitly. Uh, Reynolds is certainly one, and so is General Warren, uh, Gouverneur Warren, who again is a terrific engineer. And it's their recommendations. We should fight here, and the falling back of the first day, where it's basically a Confederate victory, but the Army of the Potomac does not fall back in disarray. They fall back on Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. They're on the high ground. All of their fighting and the cost of lives leads them to being on the high ground. And like I said, Meade is judging shoals in the middle of the Delaware Bay to try to figure out how to put a lighthouse there. He's in Florida looking at these hurricane-swept little more atolls and islands, and is able to say, here's someplace we can put a lighthouse. And while none of them are active, a ton of them are still standing. This from being in Jersey with Barnegat and Absecon and Cape May. So he understands where he is. And he's more a victim of the scuttlebutt among the generals that resent him than he is, from how to handle the battle.
Yeah, definitely seems like good leadership and trusting people below you.
No, he trusts who he's putting places. He was stuck with the chief of staff and Daniel Butterfield, and they'd had a falling out because Meade actually replaced Butterfield in command of a corps, the Fifth Corps. And then you have Daniel Sickles, who's another story all to himself. He's just he almost cost Meade the battle, and yet because of what happens to him, losing his leg and being sent as immediately as possible to Washington, he's the first general that Lincoln talks to. And Sickles is a guy, I don't know if we have time to go into Sickles, but this is an absolute scalawag who has totally screwed up Meade's line of battle on the second day. And it's the reason why we know about the wheat field and the peach orchard on the second day. But he makes sure that his side, if it weren't for him, the Gettysburg would have been lost. And he takes that fight to Meade under an assumed name with the New York Herald. Historicus, after the battle, Meade wanted to retreat. And there's generals who go and sort of tacitly or openly back him up because they feel that Meade's actions afterwards, removing Butterfield from his chief of staff, removing Doubleday from command of First Corps, because a couple of people have said he didn't follow up very well after Reynolds died. So he's got some enemies in among the generals. And there's politicians who willfully, especially the radical Republicans who want Joe Hooker back, go out of their way to say, yeah, we should investigate this guy. And they have an investigation in March of 1964. And Meade's furious to the point where he writes to Lincoln saying, I want a court of inquiry on me. Let's do this. And Lincoln writes this very kind letter that just says, I've been subject to humiliation and lies and everything else for 3 years. We all know who you are. We all know the value. There's a famous story that when Meade did not catch Lee and Lee escaped to Pennsylvania, Lincoln wrote this very long letter saying, you had him in your hands and you let him go. But the last line at the bottom of that letter is never signed, never sent. It was Lincoln's way of getting it out of his system that it didn't happen.
And that's the story that usually makes it to the books today. That Meade had the upper hand. He could have finished it, but he didn't. That's like the
No, and
tragic story.
it's interesting because a lot of the military historians, looking back and the fact, judging the material and everything, they've kind of changed a lot have changed their minds of that and said, his army was decimated, maybe not as badly as Lee's, but he lost thousands of horses that were killed in the battle or blown up in the battle. He lost his right arm. His Stonewall Jackson is John Reynolds, and he lost Hancock, who's another general he trusts implicitly. And it's Hancock who says we should fight here. There was a battle about that. Sickles even says when he comes the next day, "Oh, I made the decision to fight here." The end of the day, so he's blessed by a magnificent and courageous performance from your scared shave-tail private up through, Hancock and Reynolds. But he's, poorly served at the end of people who go after him and just say he could have smashed Lee to pieces. He couldn't have.
So beyond the military victory, how do you argue that Gettysburg altered political, social, and psychological trajectory of the entire conflict for both the Union and the Confederacy?
Well, you're full of good questions, Peter, I'll tell you.
This is my big last one, so you're good.
Well, let's see. It's a stunning loss for Lee. And very famously, Lee rides out to meet the survivors of Pickett's charge. It is my fault, men. It is all my fault. And he makes that report to Jefferson Davis, but you give him a little bit of time. And there's times where he almost writes like, Gettysburg was a victory. We just ran out of men to finish the job. I'm paraphrasing. But he knows he's never going to get a third chance to invade the North. And things settle into a stalemate. He and Meade parry in Northern Virginia, but by the end of, as the winter sets in, they're in the exact same spot they were when the campaign began. So it does change things for the South, obviously. And for the North, it's a victory that they never had in the East before. So and the Army of the Potomac, they lost again, they lost again, they lost again. Jim Bouton, the baseball player and writer, after writing Ball 4, wrote a book called I Managed Good, but Boy Did They Play Bad. And that seemed to be the line a lot of the leaders of the Army of the Potomac took before Meade. I think he gave them a sense of that. The rumors that he didn't want to fight, I found are denied at the Battle of Fredericksburg, where he comes so close to punching a hole in Lee's defenses in the Heights that had something been followed up, maybe that battle would have ended differently. Of course, Grant comes along, and while Meade is still the head of the Army of the Potomac, it's pretty much by title only. The 1864-65 campaigns are Grant's. But getting to the politics of this, I think that's where it really cements Gettysburg as such a giant landmark in our history. And in a sense, too, Peter, maybe world history, because Lincoln takes the train on November 18th and the following day. It's not an afterthought. They invited him to speak, but they'd already invited Edward Horton, who's, for those of listeners unaware, was this orator for decades. He started making orations before presidents with James Monroe 40 years ago. So he has this stem winding to talk about the Battle of Gettysburg to finish. And then Lincoln comes out and 267, 270 words, depending on the version. pretty much unites Jefferson's, you know, that all men are created equal with what he calls a new birth of freedom. And it's sort of made not just a bedrock for us as far as, is basically saying this battle really is about freedom. This battle really is about liberty, and not just for white men, but for every American. And each generation gets an opportunity to see if we can live up to that challenge or not. And sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes what does he call it? The mystic hordes of memory take us to going backwards because the past was so much better. The people nowadays who are talking about, let's go to the 1950s, kind of tend to forget the racial issues there, the medical issues there, and the tax structure. I think the high tax rate for people like Bill Gates and Mr. Bezos would be 74%. So, but I think that battlefield and the way it's been taken care of, and Lincoln's speech, it's a challenge. It's thrown right at us as soon as we start studying our history. We're dedicated to a new birth of freedom. What are you going to do as a generation about it? And pardon me for getting on a platform here, but as people are upset about the current political status of things or whichever, and this party, the Republicans, aren't living up to their constitutional oath and their responsibilities in Congress, such as the budget, and the Democrats aren't standing up, and finding out how do you stand up when you don't have any sway in the White House or in the Capitol. But all of us as grade school children stood up and said, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, with liberty and justice for all. That's our oath. That's what we should be living by. And if we want to support what's going on currently, then fine, go vote and everything else. But if you don't have to risk things and stand up and get into a situation, but you have to make sure you vote and help get people, sign up to help people register to vote. Tell your nephew or your granddaughter, don't forget to register to vote. What's George G. Nathan's line? Bad politicians are elected by good citizens who don't vote. Well, here we are. And it goes right back to Gettysburg.
Tim, really well said. What are you currently working on? And I mean, right now you're obviously talking about this book, but are you already working on anything else? Have you mind on anything?
I'm kind of taking a breather right now. I've got a couple of ideas. I'll do a pitch right now. I don't know if my agent and their editor will be listening, but I've twice said that I would like to do a book about 1963 and, how the year started and how the year ended and how much culturally changed with things. I would open it with the fact that we were kind of pretty much all in a good mood because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the number one record in the country was an album called The First Family with this impersonator, Von Meade, doing his impersonation of President Kennedy that everybody was buying and listening to and laughing to. Even Kennedy made fun of it, saying, I don't think he sounds like me. I think he sounds like Teddy. And all these great lines, the rubber swan is mine. But you have the finishing of the Apollo project and getting ready for Gemini. You have the nuclear test ban treaty. You have the civil rights demonstrations and in the South and the attacks by Bill Connor with, fire hoses on demonstrators. You have this interesting thing going on in sports culture. It's the Dodgers and the Yankees again, but they're separated by a colony now, not the East River. And the one hero is this Jewish pitcher who's probably the best pitcher who ever lived for 6 years, says the man who loves Sandy Koufax. But you have this fella, Cassius Clay, not yet Muhammad Ali, who's saying if you can do it, it ain't bragging, but you either love him or hate him, has already started with his appearances, in his fights. And then you have the Profumo scandal over in London with the members of Parliament being caught up with call girls. I remember asking my dad, why is Aunt Mandy Rice Davies being mentioned in a Sandy Grady's very funny sports column? And he goes, well, you'll have to read the front page about that, won't you? But the fact that this could take down the Macmillan government, and here we have a president who had privately his own issues. What would have happened there? You have Jim Bouton winning 21 games and pitching up a storm before his arm goes bad, loses a heartbreaking World Series. And, he's already written articles that are precursors to Ball 4, which really in 69, not just upended how you cover sports, but how you cover public figures in this country. And then you have the Kennedy assassination. And to me, with all the baby boomers being upset, particularly white middle-class baby boomers, and along in December, here comes this song, I Want to Hold Your Hand. And it's almost like a tonic, do we still feel sad? Yes, but this takes our mind off it. And no more so than the one Meade record did. So
you are ready to write this book, Tim.
Oh, I've been wanting to do this for 12 years now, so we'll see what happens.
You know what? It's the writing process of the pitch. Sometimes that stinks.
Yeah.
It's because people may not realize, but it's so like meticulous. You have to do chapter summaries. You have to give obviously the chapter sample, but then you have to look at the market and why would that book sell? How does it fit? It is such a process.
Yes.
That you, almost after you survive that process, if you still want to write the book, then you should be able to write it, because the process itself, sometimes it's like, you know what, forget it. I'm not doing this.
My wife of 48 years said to me after the first book, she had no objections to me doing a second book as long as I wrote it in Portugal.
Why Portugal?
I don't have the courage to ask.
True. Tim, where can my listeners go to learn more about your work? Do you have a website?
Not yet, but we're working on it. I being raised by nuns, there was always this, don't brag about yourself, don't do this and the other. And I've been under some pressure from Penguin and Dutton and from our agent to really ought to have a website. So my son, who's a very talented artist and art director, talent he did not get from me, but from my wife, from Sid, is almost finished with that. And I told him when we're finally finished the hoopla to go with the book coming out next month, then we'll address having a website. Other than that, obviously with Amazon, but let me put in a plug for any of you out there. See if the local bookstore has it if you're interested. We're doing a bunch of presentations they're gearing up for at the local bookstores, and I miss that. I'm obviously grateful, like Barnes and Noble, and certainly was a fan of Borders, if the local one didn't have something. And I'm not going to, and I'm very grateful that Amazon does so much for authors of any kind of work. But I think we're getting into a trend about, supporting, shop local. It isn't just for the Christmas shop down the street or, the children's clothing store or something, but it'd be nice to see the bookstores make a comeback.
Barnes & Noble has become like the local bookshop. I'm going to support Barnes & Nobles. This is a huge corporation from when 30 years ago was the corporation of books, and now it's like the local bookstore.
Yeah, it really is, and they do a great job.
Tim, thank you so much for taking the time today. This was a great interview. I really appreciate it.
Peter, thanks for having me. I appreciate your listeners and tuning in. And other than that, I can't thank you enough. Wish well for you and your family, and hope you guys have a great Thanksgiving.
Likewise, thank you. Hopefully, today's episode has inspired you to seek out and learn more about the subject. For answers to questions, to leave a comment, or check out upcoming guest announcements, visit www.historyshortspodcast.com or look for History Shorts Podcast on Facebook and X. Stay curious, and I will talk to you all tomorrow.